Well, I would love to put the idea of the Escola de Chicago to death. I think it's a very misleading idea. After all, what really happened is in the 1920s, Robert Park and his colleagues began serious research into the life of the city of Chicago. I mean, it's very bizarre that one city should be so much studied. It's really kind of crazy. But what Park did was he must have been a wonderful person. It's one of the great regrets of my life that I never met him or saw him while he was alive. But Robert Park, you probably know, had been a newspaper man. He had worked as the secretary to a great African-American leader, Booker T. Washington. He had a degree in philosophy, I imagine, from Heidelberg, I think. And I think he may have studied with George Simmel. But it was only at the age of 50 that he became a professor of sociology. And he was only professor for 15 years. And during that time, he trained dozens of students. He got all his colleagues in all the other departments to do studies in Chicago, studies that were of local things that they could observe themselves. So the political scientists studied politicians in Chicago, and the historians wrote histories of Chicago. And everybody was studying Chicago, which was indeed a wonderful thing to study. It was a city that hadn't existed 100 years earlier, and now was this enormous metropolis. And he must have been a very exciting person, because he excited all these people to do all this work. His students learned a great variety of things. People think of the Escola de Chicago as, characterized by field work, participant observation. But Park was equally interested in statistical studies, and he was the man who invented this theory of the growth of the city and studying the spatial dispersion of social phenomena like crime and divorce and mental illness and so on. So he was not a dogmatic person about methods or anything like that. I didn't have the opportunity to study with him, but I studied with someone who had been his student and was very, very close to him, Everett Hughes. And Everett was the same way. He did field work, but he also collected all kinds of statistics. He did wonderful things. He was not doctrinaire or dogmatic about how you did sociology. The School of Chicago is an invention which really came later, when people began to, within sociology, began to fight with each other. And it became identified with the idea of participant observation, field work, qualitative, so-called qualitative work, etc. So that's why I want to kill the idea. I think it's a terrible idea, because this is not the truth of what that way of thinking involved. what you could say is characteristic is close attention to the details of what you're studying in the manner of any good science. Science, doesn't exist up here. Science is the day-to-day work of collecting data, making sure they're accurate, finding ways to analyze that information so that you can say something. And when people say, how do you know that? You have a good answer. Mm-hmm. This is how I know it, and if you have any complaints, tell me, and I'll see if I have an answer for you. I mean, this is a way of thinking about scientific work that's, I think, best expressed in Bruno Latour's book, Science in Action. Mm-hmm. Well, that's different. That's not about the ideas. That's about the University of Chicago had the second sociology department in the United States. The first one was at the University of Kansas, but it did not become very famous. The one at Chicago did become famous, and for a long time it was the major department of sociology in the country. There were others. There was Columbia had a department very early. The University of Southern California had a department. But Chicago was by far the largest and most influential school. And as the discipline grew and more universities had a department of sociology and they needed professors, they would, having studied themselves at Chicago, they would call their professors in Chicago and say, do you have somebody who can come and teach in our university? And I remember when I was a student, this is late in the process, but maybe it was 1950, I was in the office of Ernest Burgess, who was one of the great names nearing the end of his career. And while we were talking, the telephone rang, and he picked it up and he said, "Oh, good morning, Forrest." Well, Forrest is not a common name, so I knew he was talking to one of his former students, Forrest LaViolette, who taught at the university called Tulane University in New Orleans. And he was the head of the department in that university. And Burgess said to him, "Oh, I see, Forrest, you're looking for a young man to teach sociology. Yes, I think we have 2 or 3 people who would be just perfect for you." And that's the way people got jobs in those days. So Chicago was very dominant, I mean, just in numbers and geographically. After World War II, that changed very dramatically. But for all those years, Chicago was not even, you wouldn't even say the #1 department. It was almost the only department that really mattered. Harvard began to train good people in the 1930s. So there was a generation of people like Robert Merton, who were PhDs from Harvard in that period. But the big change came after World War II, in the middle 1940s. And suddenly there were hundreds of jobs. There were all these universities starting a program, many of them starting graduate programs and big research programs. And there was a lot of money for research, and there was a big shortage of sociologists. And at that time, a number of other departments became also important. So there was no more, everybody wanted to be the #1 department, the way Chicago had been, but that wasn't possible. Because now you had 10 very good departments training graduate students. You know, Michigan and Harvard and Columbia and University of California, etc. University of Michigan, did I say that? So that's what people mean when they talk about Chicago. They have this kind of vague idea that Chicago dominated everything, and usually when they say that, what they mean is what's now come to be thought of as a Escola de Chicago, which is fieldwork, qualitative, you know, that sort of thing. I deny everything. I'm completely innocent. I think sociology shouldn't have a separate field called theory. When I was a student, and I've told this story elsewhere, we were worried about this, the students, and we once asked Professor Hughes, "Professor Hughes, what do you think about theory?" And Hughes said, he looked a little surprised and a little irritated, angry. He said, "Theory of what?" We thought there was something called theory that wasn't a theory of something. He understood there could be a theory about industrialization. There could be a theory about deviance. There could be a theory about n'importe quoi. But theory, he thought that was foolishness. I mean, the model for this foolishness was Talcott Parsons, who had written this enormous book called The Structure of Social Action, which very few people read, but everybody admired, even though they didn't read it, and it was not useful. So I don't think of myself as a theorist. I don't think of myself as an interactionist. In fact, somebody once said to me, "You're not much of an ist, are you?" And I thought about that, and I said, that's right, I'm not. I think it's a big mistake. People, and you know where they really do this in a terrible way is in England. Years ago, I spent 6 weeks at the University of Manchester as a visiting professor. And then I went and spent a week giving talks at different universities. And everywhere I went, something like this would happen. After I talked about whatever I was talking about, someone would get up and say, "Professor Becker." And I thought, uh-oh. Now what? He'd say, "In 1972, in your article such and such, you said blah, 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 blah. But in 1977, in another article, you said blah, 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 blah. There seems to be a contradiction. How can you explain that?" So my first answer was the truth, which is I think I must have learned something new that caused me to change my mind. Well, this was not an appropriate answer, because the image that the people who asked that kind of question had was that everything that you had ever written had been written at the same moment and had to be completely coherent and consistent. That doesn't make room for learning new things, having new ideas, reading something new that changes your mind about something, etc., which is the real life of a working scientist. So finally, I took to saying things like, well, what happened was, and I would tell a long story about why I had changed the way I spoke about that. None of this satisfied them. I was convinced that I had given a very appropriate answer, but the only answer that people who believe in theory accept is an answer that shows that after all, your ideas are coherent and they don't conflict with each other. I'm not interested in that. So I don't want to be thought of as a theorist. I'm a working research scientist, and I try to announce ideas that have been helpful to me in doing that work, and I hope they'll be helpful to other people. Yeah, I think that's very unfortunate. There are many things that feed that phenomenon. The international competition, using these stupid measures of achievement. It's not as bad in the United States as it is in France and England. England is, I think, now totally impossible. Everybody I know there complains that they're constantly being assessed. They use that word. Are you doing well? It's a kind of business school model, and it's a very bad thing. But I know that that's a fact, and I can only say I'm sorry. And I feel bad for the people that have to work under those conditions. And I think everyone it would be a good idea for everyone to start looking for other ways of publishing, other ways of supporting the work they want to do, and so forth. I mean, that's not a very cheerful thing to tell people, but I don't think it's time for cheerful talk. I mean, something has to change in a serious way. I think the way I approach the problems of deviance in that book can be applied anywhere. I mean, you see, people say, oh, he invented the theory of labeling, which is really completely wrong. I didn't invent anything, really. What I did was apply very well-known ideas in the field of sociology to that specific area of activity. I looked at laws, crimes, law enforcement, courts, police, the professional worlds of crime, etc. And I said, how can I understand this using the tools that sociology gives me? Well, I mean, a couple of the most obvious ideas in sociology that everyone agrees with, no matter what their theoretical position, one is what W.I. Thomas spoke of as the definition of the situation. That is, people act in certain ways because they see the world around them, the people around them, in this way. They define these things in this way, although those things could have been defined in other ways. It's so you see two kids doing something that seems maybe they shouldn't be doing. You can say, oh, well, they're young, they have a lot of energy, leave them alone, it'll be all right. Or you can say, oh my God, they're breaking the law, they have to go to jail. That's what those boys did hasn't changed. But the way you look at it and the way you describe it changes them in your mind. And so you see, now I have to do this. But in a certain way, the model for everything, you know, is a game of chess. That is, once we all understand what the rules are, then we play, because I say to myself, if I make this move, what is João going to do? He's going to do this. Then I'll do this. Then he'll do that. And we are always thinking, what are the other people here doing? What can I expect them to do? etc. And that's what we react to. So that's one idea. The other idea is that that nobody ever acts all by themselves, alone. Even if they seem to be alone, their head is filled with other people who they know eventually will be involved in what they're doing. If I sit at my computer and write, I'm writing thinking about the many people who might read what I'm writing. Will they understand what I said? Maybe I should say it this way. Oh, what would João say about that? Maybe I should read his last article, etc. I'm thinking, if I put this in a book, who is going to publish my book? Maybe I should change what I'm doing so that someone will want to publish it. There are all these kinds of things that you're thinking about even when you're alone. And when you're teaching, you're in a room full of students, and you're thinking every second, and so are they. You're thinking, what are they going to do? If I tell a joke, will they laugh? If I say something that seems outrageous and terrible to them, will some of them start crying? Will they attack me? Will they denounce me to the head of the university? I mean, these are things that everybody knows are possible. The most common way that I see my work being referred to is a footnote, which says, they say something like, I'm looking at the world that has grown up around the art of disco music. Footnote, Becker. And then see, people who use the ideas don't write at length about that. They use them. They don't criticize them, or they don't defend them. They just say, "Oh, this is an idea I can use." I'm not aware of being attacked so much. I mean, there's some people who are always writing theoretical articles and attacking everybody, and that's okay, You know how I feel, João, is that everybody has to make a living. They have to earn, they have to do something. But the idea that sociology or academic life generally are some kind of tournament in which the knights are fighting with each other to see who is the biggest and best knight, that's not my idea of science. Science is, in its very nature, it's a collaborative activity. Everybody is so dependent on everybody else. And I like to recognize that and take advantage of what that offers to me. I'm not trying to be, a nice boy. I think that's realistic. That is how science works. You can look around and see it for yourself. But the quarrels make for more interesting newspaper stories. A lot of the chapters in that book are about numbers, methods of presenting numbers. If you remember, there's one of the people I admire greatly was a statistician named John Tukey, who invented all these very interesting methods of representing numbers. We're so accustomed to seeing just a table or a correlation coefficient or a mean or, all those things. And he presented all these other ways of displaying numerical data that are very useful in research, very useful in presenting your research to somebody else. I think that's just marvelous. That's exactly what we should be doing. So I think it's not equality. I don't think I said that. I mean, a lot of the things I talk about are things that are not numerical. I mean, photographs. Well, photographs, I mean, that's always very funny to me, that people think somehow that's not a scientific activity, because a large number of the so-called hard sciences, the natural sciences, rely on photographs. That's how they work. I mean, astronomy is, after all, nothing but photographs. That's all it is. That's all their data is, photographs. People who look in microscopes, you know, they're making photographs. When the atom smasher machines, you know, they do that, do you know how those work? They do the same thing hundreds of thousands of times, and they photograph each collision. Most of the time, nothing happens. You know, most of the time they shoot an electron down the accelerator and nothing happens. Once in a very great while, very seldom, an atom gets split. Well, they photograph every single one of those collisions, and there are people who look. I know, because the mother of a friend of mine did this work for years. They look, and they look for the 1 in 200,000 or 2 million photographs that shows a collision and the results of that collision. But photography is the basis of that science. So I always think of photography as very scientific, not qualitative, except in the sense that all these things are qualitative. Exactly. You understand that perfectly. I think every form of representation has to be made specially for the thing you're representing. I mean, you don't put the same frame around every picture. I mean, it's clear that some things have to be shown visually because you're talking about that. And some great works in social science. Have you ever seen the book? You might not have, because it's kind of rare. It's called Balinese Character. Balinese Character is a book made by Gregory Bateson and Margaret Mead. They worked on the island of Bali for I don't know how long. And they made films, and they also made hundreds and hundreds and hundreds, Bateson did, of still photographs, which show in very exact detail the things that they want to talk about, which are gestures, facial expressions, things like that that don't last for very long, so you have to photograph them because they're gone. So Bateson photographed all this stuff. Mead stood alongside him with a notebook, writing down everything, who these people are in the picture, what they're doing, what time it is, all of that. Well, when the time came to display this work, how should they do that? It's not obvious. What they did was to make a book called Balinese Character, and the book consists of, I don't remember how many, let's say 100 pairs of pages. On this page are anywhere from 6 to 10 or more photographs of the thing they're talking about. And on this side are 2 paragraphs explaining what what you can see in these photographs, and then in each photograph explaining what exactly in that particular image is of scientific importance. That's the best way to do that, because that's what they want you to see. Just as for some things, if I make a survey, no one wants to see each page of every questionnaire. That's not interesting. Nobody wants to see that. What they want to see are what we think of as the results. Add them all up. Now, how many people said this and how many people said that? So the best way to do that is to make a table. So I think every format is a possible way of displaying certain kinds of things. And I'm very impressed always because one of the things I learned as an adult was to make photographs. I went to art school and studied photography. And I became acquainted with, there's a wonderful literature of what you could call photographic social science. Probably most of the photographers would not think this was a good thing to be said about their work. But someone like Robert Frank, the Swiss-American photographer who made a wonderful book called The Americans, which is the record of a trip he made across the continent, photographing wherever he went. And it's a kind of implicit theory about the nature of American society at that time. It's wonderfully displayed, and there's nothing more to say. Well, I've always thought that I think I say this in the book, that every way of describing something is perfect for something. Mm-hmm. So the question that everybody has to answer for themselves is this way of describing something perfect for something that I want it to do? If you show me a table that says these people, 62% believe this and 38% believe that, is that good enough for what I want to use it for? There are hundreds of things it won't be useful for. Mm-hmm. Well, that's where the disagreement lies, not about the method, but about what we want to do, what we want to achieve with this result. If you tell me I found a perfect way to make pizza, okay, I don't want to make pizza. It's not interesting to me. It doesn't help me. So usually what people mean when they say you have to do it this way is it's perfect for something they want to do, and I should want that too. And if I don't, I'm a bad person. Well, then that's people calling each other bad names. That's not a scientific argument. Science happens, and this is, you find in Thomas Kuhn and Latour, and generally speaking, everybody knows this, that science happens when a lot of people become interested in certain questions and use more or less the same ways to find answers. And when they propose an answer, other people will say, oh, that's a terrific answer, thank you very much. But some other people will say, I don't believe you because you didn't take care to avoid this problem. And that's what the work of science is getting rid of the problems that people propose to you as serious problems about what you want to say. So, you know, in my own work, when we did a study of medical students many years ago, we did it, you know, sort of anthropologically. Several of us went to a medical school and we spent 3 years, spending all day, every day, going with the students, watching what they did, watching when they examined patients, when they went into the operating room for the surgery, etc., etc. And this was at a period when there was a lot of interest in studies of so-called higher education, of professional schools like medicine and law, of graduate training in the sciences. And there were many psychologists, mostly very interested in that. Well, psychologists usually are trained in experimental methods, which are based on animal experiments for the most part. And you know, you can do all sorts of things to rats that you're not allowed to do to people, so you can't really use the same methods. But they're used to that way of thinking. And my colleagues and I were often invited to meetings where people discussed how to do research in higher education. And they were all doing surveys and psychological tests and so forth. And they were very unhappy with what we said. And I remember I had a discussion with one of them, a very famous psychologist who worked in that field. And I asked her, I said, "Do you think we're wrong?" She said, "No, I'm sure you're right. I'm sure everything you say is the way it is." I said, "Well, what's the problem?" She said, "Well, you don't show us how you know. You just say, this is how it is. And here's an example. But we don't know. Maybe there are other things that happen." So I said, okay. So my colleagues and I went to a great deal of trouble to find and identify and count every instance of the things we were describing. So it isn't just this unusual event. This sort of thing, defined in this way, happened 762 times. And it happened in every department of the medical school. So we saw it under varying circumstances, etc. And we wrote the book that way. Then I saw this same psychologist and I said, "How's that? Is that what you wanted to know?" She says, "Absolutely. Now I have no complaints." The French guy who writes about the Chicago school, Jean-Michel Chapulis, do you know his book? A very good book. I'll show you. Jean-Michel said, "Well, it's a good thing you did that in that book, because now no one will ever have to do that again. Now you've made it clear what this kind of work depends on, and everyone will know that that's what other people are doing, so they don't have to make all these numbers and things." Well, I hope so. You see, I think that the worst enemy of knowledge about society is what everybody knows. The things that, well, everybody knows that those people are like that. Everybody knows that criminals are bad people who do bad things. So I think this is a big obstacle, a big problem in trying to understand the world. If you think you already know, then that's bad. I never think I know. I'm always ready to be wrong. And in fact, when I used to teach, I taught methods of field research. I taught people in the simplest way. The first day of the class, I would say, "All right, your job in this class for the next 10 weeks is to find some place where people are doing things together and watch them do whatever they're doing, ask them whatever questions you can think of, write down everything you see and hear, and on Thursday, when you come back, give me your field notes, what you wrote down. So there would be, everybody would be very upset. We're not ready to choose. I said, oh yes you are, because I will not let anybody leave this room until they tell me where you're going and who you're going to watch and talk to. No, we're not ready. I said, you never will be ready. Just go and do it. Don't argue with me. I'm the teacher. And so, because I always had a reputation, of being a nice guy, not tough, etc. So they were very surprised by it. I was very hard, very stern. So they'd go, they'd do it, they'd come back, and they'd give me like 1 or 2 pieces of paper. I didn't even look at them. I said, not enough. What do you mean it's not enough? I said, you people tell me you stayed in this place 2, 3, 4 hours, and this is all that happened? 1 sheet of paper? I don't believe it. You didn't write down everything in it. Well, we wrote down the important things. I said, you don't know what the important thing is. That's what you're going to find out. Well, it was terrible. The first 2 or 3 weeks, they were very angry with me. And then the other thing was they would say, well, you didn't give us a reading list. You didn't assign anything to read. What should we read? I said, I don't know, because I don't know what you're studying. If I knew what you were studying, I could tell you what to read. But the class class was like this. João, what did you do yesterday? Oh, I went to this bar, and I sat there and I had a caipirinha, and I talked to this guy, and he said blah, 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 blah. And then the guy behind the bar said blah, blah, blah. And then, if somebody describes something like that in detail, you can always say, oh, but I don't understand this. What are they doing? And then usually people would say, oh, well, what they're really doing is this. I said, how do you know that? Well, everybody knows that. No, I don't know it. How are you going to find out? How? And so the whole 10 weeks they spent learning what kinds of questions to ask, how to find a new question. And I would get them talking to each other, because as long as they talk to me, it's not good. When they learn from each other, then they're learning how to do science, because science works that way. Not somebody tells you this is the right way. How you use them? Well, it's usually pretty obvious. I mean, the parable that I use in that book is David Anton's story about this country where the air is so terrible that no one can breathe. Well, you can see that it's a story about how everything depends on everything else. I love the part where he shows how the expressions in the common language refer to all this. Like how riding all night on the bus with your girlfriend is a metaphorical way of speaking about sex and sexual activity. Because, and then you have to know the whole story of what's going on there to understand that the only way 2 people can be alone is to buy a special private compartment in the bus where you can be absolutely alone. A lot of people do this because the air is better, but these people do it because that's the only place they can be alone, and etc. That's a very obvious use of that. But it's not different from the use of an ideal type. An ideal type is the same thing. You know there's no such thing as an ideal bureaucracy. All bureaucracies fail to be ideal bureaucracies. So they're just stories about what a real bureaucracy would be if it actually did what it says it does. So that gives you a way of thinking about the real bureaucracies, you know, that you encounter. And I don't have to tell a Brasileiro about bureaucracy. That's my strangest experiences in Brazil. With getting the visto, I tell that somewhere in that experience. And where I learned the word despachante. Right? We don't have despachantes here. You know, that doesn't exist. We have people who do things like that occasionally. There are places where you need somebody who knows how to make this, has the jeito, knows how to make this happen. But we don't have a profession, because it's a long story. I don't want to go into it, and I've written it so you can find it. But I needed to get this document called a visto so that I could leave the country at the end of my stay, you know, teaching at the Museo Nacional. So I didn't have it, and I was working through the Ford Foundation, Fundação Ford. Mm-hmm. And somebody said to me, "You don't have to worry." I said, "What do you mean I don't have to? I'm very worried." He said, "No, you don't have to worry, because this is a Fundação Ford. We have the best despachante in Rio de Janeiro." I said, "Well, that's wonderful. Where is my visto?" He said, "Don't worry." I forget his name now. "He'll have it for you." And every day I got more nervous and more upset. And my friend Gilberto Velho was dying of laughter. He thought it was so funny, this gringo was so worried. And he said to me, "Now you know what it's like to be a Brasileiro. Now you understand." Right? So I understood, you know, that's an ideal type, bureaucracy. The reality is, this is how it works. Yeah. Okay, and mathematical models are perfect ideal types, because they have strict rules. Everything happens this way, and they're useful usually as ways of showing that something is impossible. This is a book about a very simple thing that happens every night all over the world. 3 or 4 guys who don't know each other, have never met, never played together, so certainly they have never rehearsed anything, come to some place, a bar or a ballroom or some place where there's a party, and they unpack their instruments, and for 3 or 4 hours they play. They play just as though they had rehearsed for months, and nobody knows that they never met before. How do they do that? I mean, it's a really interesting sociological question. So the first answer, and it's the answer I used to give. I used to present this as something you can understand by using the idea of culture. They all share certain knowledge. They all know that, in this case, they all know the same songs. So if I say, "João, let's play Desafinado," you say, "Okay." We start playing. Well, my colleague Faulkner, who I wrote this book with, He's a trumpetista. I'm a piano player. So he still works. He's younger than me, and he lives in a place where there's still some work. So he works 2-3 nights a week. He's a professor at the university, but he still plays. So he started to make field notes, write down what happened. Well, the first thing that happened is the little story I begin with, do you know, is not true. That's not what happens. What happens is, he says, do you know, isn't it romantic? Maybe somebody says, sure. Or maybe they say, what key? Or maybe they say, no, I don't know that one. How about we play this one instead? Let's fall in love, B flat. And they do this till they find something that they can agree on. Or, even more interesting, sometimes somebody says, no, I don't know that. You play the first chorus, I'll play the second one. That means he knows how to listen once, and then he's going to play that song. That's an interesting skill. It means he doesn't have to share knowledge of that song. He has to share some other kind of knowledge. What knowledge are they sharing? Sometimes he'll say, the other guy might say, he might ask another question. He might say, no, I don't know it. And the first guy says, it's easy. It's I Got Rhythm, which is an old song by George Gershwin. And the bridge, the middle part, is Honeysuckle Rose. It's an old song by Fats Waller. He says, oh, okay. Now he knows how to play it. See? That's what the book is about. And then, what happened that makes it really interesting, it's also about change, social change. Because over the period of years that Faulkner and I were in the business, have been in the business, the conditions of work changed tremendously. The kinds of places I used to play in, and that he still plays in, became fewer and fewer and fewer. There wasn't, and there was new kinds of music that was being played. So now people don't say an old song by George Gershwin. They say, can you play John Coltrane's Giant Steps? Giant Steps is another kind of song altogether. And if you don't know how to, if you haven't learned that, you're not going to be able to play it, just like that. If you've learned that whole way of thinking and playing, which is quite different, you can play it. The reason that could become a standard form in that business is because jazz is not popular music anymore. Jazz is art music, played for a small group of aficionados who have studied it right along with the players. They understand this. And that it means that there are new places to play. It's a new way to make a living. All of that. And it's very, very different. And that the book is partly about that. And that was exactly something that, you know, we had experienced, but we didn't think about until we began to see it in our field notes. Aha. Because after all, we were part of that world. So we reacted like older people often do. We said, this is terrible, this is bullshit, this is not real jazz. I don't want to, no, that's not social science, that's the old musician talking. We have to look at this like sociologists. That's a nice book. I don't know. The problem with this book is a very interesting problem. The problem is that it requires people to understand something, not very much, but a little bit about music. When you open it up, you'll see there's actual musical examples, you know, notes. Oh my God. It's like seeing a mathematical formula. Oh, I don't know that. I don't want to hear about that. But then we have another book, and I'm going to send you this because it's an electronic book, an e-book. Can you read those? Okay. There is a real age difference. My friends who are 60 and 70 say, I don't read e-books. Meaning I'm afraid of the computer, I don't know what's... So this book consists of, Faulkner lives in Massachusetts. I live here. We didn't meet. Almost never. In the 3 years we were working on this, I think we met once or twice. Most of the time we played. We didn't talk about sociology. And everything we did was by email, back and forth, sometimes a dozen exchanges a day, like a conversation. What you would have if you were working together in the same room, only it's written down. And I got involved with we got involved with a conceptual artist in France named Franck Libovici. It's a book, it's 100 art projects that he persuaded people to do. And it involved making stickers. He did all that. So when you buy this book, you get the book and 200 stickers. You know, it's like for football, like the kids have for football. And then you have to trade them because you don't have all the 200 you need. It's a very complicated thing. But what he did was he asked people, artists mainly, but sometimes people like me, he said, make something that shows the forme de vie, the form of life, that makes your work possible. And I didn't know what to do. I mean, Diane is a filmmaker and photographer, you know. So she had something she wanted to make for him. But she said, well, you and Rob sent, you know, millions of emails back and forth. That's the form of life that supports your work. So we'll collect all the emails. So the e-book is all those emails, plus every time we mention a song, which we mention hundreds, there's a link to something on YouTube where you could hear that song. It's perfect. Well, Zimmel, Everett Hughes, my teacher, said to me, you know, you read Zimmel, you don't read to find Zimmel's theory. You read Zimmel, like you turn the pages, you find ideas. You read 3 or 4 pages, you will find an idea you can use. If you have a problem, start looking in Zimmel. You'll find something. It's not the theory of this or the theory of that. It's those little... You know what it's like reading? It's like reading Wittgenstein. If you read the philosophical investigations, I mean, I suppose some people read it from the beginning to the end. But I've never... I open it up and look and see if there's something interesting. I mean, he says a lot of interesting things. I don't really care about philosophical theories, but I mean, one of my favorite things he said was, that if a lion could speak, we wouldn't understand him. But what he means is that, because he's talking about forms of life, etc., that the line has a way of life that we don't understand at all. So there's no possible way that we could understand what he said. And I thought, well, that's very interesting. Maybe we could change it. If a lion could speak, we wouldn't understand him at first. But it's an implication of that way of thinking that if we kept talking, we would have something now, a way of life in common, at least the talking. So we would have something we could talk about and point to, and we would begin to understand. Oh, I'm always finding new, like this Alain de Rosière, that's one that I just found today. But I have favorites, you know. Thomas Kuhn is a favorite. Latour is a favorite. Hughes is a real favorite. Because I read Hughes the way he said to read Zimmel. He just has hundreds of interesting ideas. You can always find something. But a lot of the people I read are not in sociology at all. I mean, the whole book, Art World, started from something I read by a musicologist. The same importance they always had. People will act toward things in the ways that they define them. So if I say, he's crazy, which people still do say, then, or if I say, don't trust João, be careful, he'll take your money. That's labeling, and that still happens, so it's always a useful idea. I mean, in general, the book I wrote about art is really labeling, because part of it is to say that the big question for people in the philosophy of art business is what is art and what is not art? Well, I don't treat that as a philosophical issue. I treat that as a practical problem that people in those businesses have to solve to make sure that what they do is people define as art. And I don't think there's a difference between this is art and this isn't, and we can discover the thing that distinguishes them. No. The difference is that some people say this is art. Nobody says this is. Well, nobody tried to stop me. Nobody said you can't say that. I mean, a lot of people thought what I was saying was terrible. And in fact, the new book that will be published in August, the expression "what about murder" is a question that someone asked me in public. Mm-hmm. When Outsiders first appeared, this very distinguished older sociologist, Philip Selznick, asked me at a meeting where I had presented this. He said, "What about murder? Isn't murder really deviant?" Well, that's a very interesting question, because what it told me is I wanted to use the word deviant as a technical term. It's a term that we're going to call this thing where somebody says João is a thief. We're going to call that, if the person succeeds in having João called a thief, he's been labeled. That's the way I want to use it. Selznick wanted to use it as a term of moral judgment. Deviant means evil. So that, yeah, people ask me that question. But more often, like when I first did when I first presented the material on marijuana at a meeting, what do you think the response was? Nobody was interested. I said, well, why did you do that? Nobody cares about that. Meaning, it's not a big public problem. Nobody's complaining that their children are going crazy from smoking marijuana, et cetera, et cetera. It's something, you know, Mexicans do that. Who cares? I mean, is that... but so I wasn't greeted with, you know, repression. Nobody cared. Which, of course, as many people loved to point out, that's a form of repression, not to take it seriously. But then people did take it seriously. So, I don't, you know, the Cold War didn't really reach, Marxists felt it because for many years, I mean, it's certainly true that, see now, Durkheim, Weber, Marx is the holy trinity of theory. You say to a graduate student in the United States, I'm sure elsewhere, who are the three greatest theorists? Marx, Durkheim, Weber. It's like one word. Marx, Durkheim, Weber. But in this country, Marx was a little suspect because you could be accused of being a communist. Also, it was very difficult to read. It was another thing that... but it wasn't part of the standard what people read and talked about. So, and it was, repressed would be a strong word, but it was ignored, it's a better word. And then in the 60s, of course, that changed very radically, and now it's orthodox. That has a lot to do, by the way, with the shortage of professors. When there were not enough professors to teach all the classes, the universities discovered that Marxists were just fine. Somebody has to teach these students. I mean, you know, it's like a real problem for somebody who's running a university. I have 500 students who have to take Sociology 1. I don't have anybody. Well, under those circumstances, you know, people who you would never hire, all of a sudden you decide, I think I'll hire. I had a student who went to teach at the University of Michigan, which was a very good department. He hadn't finished his dissertation yet, but they hired him anyway because they were going to have 500 students. Someone had to teach them. And Larry showed up at his first faculty meeting wearing a costume from Captain America, the comic book. I mean, can you imagine? 10 years earlier, they would have thrown him out. No, it's okay. Neuroscience?
Yes.
Well, I think, I'm trying to think of the polite way to say this. I don't think there's anything in neuroscience that is of the least use in understanding criminal behavior. I think, you know, what neuroscience shows you is parts of the brain lighting up, which is the consequence of a computer program that reads information coming from electrical impulses in the brain. And that makes these little lights light up on the screen. And then the fun starts, because then people start to invent stories. What's going on when the little lights light up? For all I know, there are little elves, little people inside the brain, lighting the lights, running around. I mean, it's a ridiculous. It's not even worth talking about. But that's the consequence, you know, of popular science becoming a very saleable commodity, something you can make money selling. So people write books about it, and they can get research money because it's very fashionable. Well, a lot of it is just something that, beginning students in sociology have to take classes in something. So that's something that, big cities have always been problematic. So sociologists have studied them and have written a lot about it. That's what Park was doing. And historically, they have, obviously a major importance. One of Park's wonderful lines is, in the modern world, everybody lives in the city or is on their way to the city. So that, that's why from Zimmel and Louis Wirth and all these people are worrying about modern society. What will happen? I'm old enough, João, that I have heard the end of the world predicted many times. People are always saying, oh, this is it, like civilization is going to crumble. It's always crumbling, it's always been crumbling.